ever feel like some part of you, well, it's like stuck in the past, like something from when you were a kid is still kind of messing with how you react or feel today?
Mm.
You're definitely not alone. Today, we're going to dive deep into this whole inner child thing.
It is really kind of wild how much our early experiences, even if we're not thinking about them, they still shape us.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea of the inner child. I mean, it's not literal.
Right.
It's not like a tiny version of us hanging out
Not
somewhere.
exactly. It's more like it's more of a psychology concept. It's about these core emotional patterns, like the stuff we develop as kids, like all the unmet needs, the hurts, and even just the ways we learn to deal with stuff back then. All of that, it becomes part of our subconscious. You know what I mean?
So it's like even if we don't realize it,
Hmm.
those childhood experiences, especially the tough ones, they kind of stick with us.
They really do. They shape how we see the world, our relationships, how we see ourselves even. And sometimes stuff that we might not even think of as trauma, it can still leave a mark.
That's interesting because I think a lot of people, when they hear trauma, they imagine, some big dramatic event.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's more nuanced than that.
It is. Trauma, it's not always like this one big obvious thing. It's more about the impact on the person. For some, it might be like growing up with a lot of chaos. For others, it could be feeling like they're always being criticized or never feeling good enough. It can even be subtler things like emotional neglect or maybe never feeling seen or heard. Those things, they can leave an emotional mark, even if nobody ever really talked about it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I remember growing up, I was always the peacemaker in my family. Like if my parents were fighting, I felt this like huge need to smooth things over, even if it meant like shrinking myself or ignoring my own feelings.
And that's a perfect example right there of how these patterns we develop early on, they can really play out in our lives. And it's not about pointing fingers, blaming our past or our parents or anything. It's about understanding where these patterns come from so we can actually start making conscious choices about how we show up in the world today.
It's like our inner child is, I don't know, still kind of navigating life based on what it learned back then, even if those coping mechanisms aren't really working for us anymore.
Exactly. So, like, if you grew up always having to be the responsible one, always taking care of everyone else's needs before your own,
Like me, always trying to keep the peace.
you might find, as an adult, that you struggle with people-pleasing. You have a hard time setting boundaries. Maybe you're constantly putting other people's needs ahead of your own, even when it's hurting you.
Okay, that is weirdly accurate. It's kind of spooky how those patterns can stick around even when we're like consciously trying to be different. And this is where it gets really interesting for me because how do we even know if it our inner child running the show in those moments? What are some signs, things to look out for in ourselves?
Well, one thing is to pay attention to those emotional reactions, those times when you have a really strong reaction and it feels out of proportion to what's going on. Like a minor setback makes you totally anxious or mad. Or maybe you realize you keep ending up in the same kinds of unhealthy relationships, even though logically you know better.
Oh, the relationship patterns.
Mm.
Definitely been there. It's like
Oh,
our inner child is trying to recreate something familiar, even if it's really not good for us. So then how do we actually start to heal from those old wounds and, I don't know, learn to relate to ourselves and other people in healthier ways?
well, the first step is just being aware. Like with anything else, if we don't acknowledge it's there, we can't heal it. Just realizing that, hey, these patterns are connected to stuff that happened in the past, specifically emotions that maybe we didn't have the tools to deal with as kids. That's actually incredibly powerful.
So just acknowledging that our inner child is there, that's a huge first step.
It really is. It's about saying, okay, those younger parts of me, they're still with me, and they might have some important things to tell me about what they need to heal.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? How do we connect with and listen to this inner child? It all feels kind of abstract. Am I really supposed to be like having a conversation with my 8-year-old self?
It might sound a little, I don't know, out there, but inner dialogue, it can be really helpful.
Okay, yeah, walk me through that a little bit.
Sure. It's really about creating space, for compassion and just understanding that younger part of ourselves. Think of it like this. Imagine you've got a friend who's going through something rough. Maybe they're anxious, insecure, kind of reactive. How would you be with them?
Oh, definitely with kindness, patience. I wouldn't like judge them for it.
Exactly. You'd offer support, reassurance, just listen, right? Now, imagine giving that same compassion to your own inner child. That's what we're talking about.
So it's like being the loving parent. We maybe didn't have 80, the supportive friend at the same time.
Yeah.
All for that little us.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, it's a process. Some days will be easier than others. Celebrate the little victories, the baby steps forward. And when you do slip up, because we all do, meet yourself with that compassion, not self-criticism.
That makes a lot of sense. So instead of beating ourselves up or judging that younger part of us, it's more like offering understanding and support.
Precisely. And you can actually practice this. Things like journaling can help, or meditation. Find a quiet spot, close your eyes, and try to bring to mind a memory or maybe a feeling that's really charged for you. Then see if you can actually visualize yourself back then. Like actually picture what you looked like as an 8-year-old or whatever age feels right.
I like that, picturing yourself at that age. Makes it feel more real somehow.
Right, it does. Then, with as much kindness as you can muster, ask that younger you, what are you feeling? What do you need me to hear? You might be surprised by the answers you get.
Wow. That's pretty powerful stuff. So we're not trying to like change the past, but
Mhm.
we are trying to offer ourselves the understanding and support we maybe didn't get back then.
You got it. And it's amazing how much simply feeling heard, feeling validated, can shift those old patterns we get stuck in.
It's like we're finally giving ourselves permission to feel those emotions that maybe as kids we just weren't equipped to deal with at the time.
Exactly. And as you do that, you may also start noticing how those old patterns, they pop up in your life today,
Hmm.
in how you relate to people, in your work, even just how you talk to yourself inside your own head.
So how do we change those patterns?
Yep.
Because it's one thing to see them, right? It's another thing entirely to actually break free.
Absolutely. And it takes time, it takes practice, and a whole lot of self-compassion. This isn't about becoming some perfect version of ourselves. It's more about showing up for ourselves with more understanding and kindness than maybe we knew how to access before.
And part of that is knowing when to ask for help, right?
100%. Asking for help is not weak. It takes strength and courage. Sometimes we need a little extra guidance, and that's more than okay.
So for someone listening who's like, okay, this inner child stuff, this resonates, where's a good place to start, like practically speaking?
A great starting point is to just pay attention to your emotions, those reactions, those times when you're feeling triggered, you're overly sensitive, or it feels like you're reacting from a place of old hurt. Those are your clues.
It's like our inner child is waving its arms going, hey, remember this old wound? It needs some attention over here.
Exactly. As you start to tune in, you might be amazed how often those patterns show up. Once you see them, then you can start trying out different ways to work with them. More compassion, more understanding for yourself.
This makes me think about how we talk about self-care, but this is next level self-care. It's not just bubble baths and face masks, right?
Yeah.
This is deep.
Right. It's not that those things are bad, they can be great, but this is about being intentional about how we take care of ourselves, body and mind. And realizing that self-care isn't selfish, it's vital. How can we show up for anyone else if we're running on empty emotionally?
That's such a good point. Got to fill our own cups first. And sometimes that means going back and taking care of those old hurts that we're carrying around.
Could not agree more. And it's okay to start small. It doesn't have to be this big, overwhelming thing. Maybe it's 5 minutes journaling. Maybe it's adding a loving kindness meditation into your day. Little things add up.
So we've talked about connecting with our inner child, nurturing those younger parts of ourselves. This naturally leads into self-care, but not in the superficial way we usually hear about it.
Right. It's not just about bubble baths and face masks, although those things can be lovely. It's about really being thoughtful in how we care for ourselves physically and emotionally. And realizing that self-care is not selfish. It's essential to our well-being.
It's about giving ourselves that same kindness and compassion we'd give a close friend, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And understanding that healing isn't a straight line. There'll be ups and downs, moments you feel like you've made progress, and moments it's like you're back at square one. Be patient with yourself. Be patient with the process. It's a journey, not a destination.
What about therapy or other kinds of professional support? When is it a good idea to reach out for help on this journey?
Therapy, it can be so helpful, especially if we're dealing with, some deeper stuff, or if it's just hard to move past those old patterns on our own. A good therapist, they can provide a safe space to really dig into this stuff and find ways to cope that actually work.
Yeah, and there are so many different approaches to therapy now. Talk therapy, art therapy, even stuff that works with the body, those somatic therapies. Have you found that some types are especially useful for inner child work?
They can all be good in different ways. It really just depends on the person. Talk therapy is awesome for understanding those thought patterns, where they're coming from. Art therapy, it can be amazing for getting at those emotions that are hard to put into words. And then the somatic stuff.
That's what I was curious about, because I've heard that those can be really powerful for trauma, since trauma often gets, like, stuck in the body. Is that your experience too?
Absolutely. We put so much focus on the mental and emotional side of healing, but our bodies, they hold on to this stuff too. Somatic work can help release that trapped energy, that tension.
Can you give an example of what that might look like?
Sure. One approach that's become pretty popular is EMDR. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It uses these like bilateral stimulations like eye movements or tapping, even sounds, to help your brain process traumatic memories like on a deeper level.
So it's like we're helping our nervous system to kind of reset and re-regulate itself.
Ah.
It's wild how connected the mind and body are. We tend to treat them as separate, but when you realize how much they influence each other, it opens up a whole new world of healing.
It really does. And oftentimes, when you release trauma from the body, it unlocks a whole lot of emotional healing and insights, stuff you might not have even been able to access otherwise, like creating space for yourself to just be whole.
I love that. This is all so powerful, but I also want to acknowledge it's not always easy to go to those deeper places. It can be uncomfortable, even painful. What advice would you give to someone who's maybe a little scared or feeling overwhelmed by this idea of inner child work?
That's totally valid. It's like reopening old wounds. It makes sense to feel that way. Be kind to yourself, first and foremost. You don't have to do everything at once. Baby steps. Start small, maybe just a few minutes of journaling, thinking back on your childhood.
And just noticing those times when you feel triggered, that's a huge step too. It's like we're finally shining a light on those patterns that have been running the show for years without us even realizing it.
You got it. And remember, it's 100% okay to reach out for support. A therapist, a trusted friend, or family member, you are not alone in this.
Such an important reminder. Sometimes just knowing you have support makes all the difference. And it's important to remember, healing, it's not a finish line you cross. It's a journey. It's about learning to treat ourselves with compassion and understanding.
Beautifully said. It's realizing we're all just doing our best with what we've got. And when we can approach ourselves and others with that kind of grace, it can transform our lives. It can even transform the world around us.
I love that. So for our listeners who are now feeling inspired to start this journey of inner child healing, what's one thing you want to leave them with today?
Be patient with yourselves. Be kind to yourselves. And remember, you are worthy of love and healing. This journey, it might not always be easy, but it is so incredibly rewarding.
Beautifully said. And listeners, as always, we want to hear from you. What resonated with you today? What did your inner child want you to know? Share your thoughts in the comments, and until next time, keep diving deep.